They called it a coward's turn, a maneuver that looked like retreat, a desperate hook back toward the enemy that defied every instinct drilled into fighter pilots. When he first sketched it on a chalkboard in a humid Guadalcanal briefing tent, his squadron laughed. Some shook their heads, others walked out. 3 weeks later, that same maneuver would account for 11 confirmed Japanese zeros in a single engagement. And the man who invented it had never shot down an airplane in his life. The Solomon Islands chain stretches across the South Pacific like a broken spine, volcanic peaks rising from waters so blue they seem artificial. In the autumn of 1942, these islands represented the absolute edge of American reach in the Pacific War. Beyond them lay an ocean dominated by Japanese carriers, Japanese bombers, and Japanese fighters that had proven devastatingly superior in the war's opening months. Guadalcanal sat at the chain's southern end. The Marines had landed in August, seizing a half-finished airstrip that would become Henderson Field. What followed was a grinding nightmare of attrition. Japanese bombers arrived with clockwork regularity from Rabaul, 400 miles to the northwest. The pilots called them the Tokyo Express, though that name would later belong to the night-running destroyers. By day, the bombers came escorted by Zeros. The Zero. Even saying the name carried weight in those months. American pilots had been told their fighters were superior. They had been told Japanese aircraft were inferior copies of Western designs, flown by pilots with poor eyesight and no initiative. These assumptions had proven catastrophically wrong. The Mitsubishi A6M2 was lighter than anything the Americans flew. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther. In the hands of pilots with years of combat experience over China, it was a predator beyond anything the Pacific Fleet had anticipated. At Midway, the carrier-based Zeros had slaughtered American torpedo bombers. Over the Philippines, they had swept the skies clean. Now, over Guadalcanal, they were methodically destroying the Cactus Air Force, the ragged collection of Marine and Navy pilots defending Henderson Field. The F-4F Wildcat was what America had to fight with. Stubby, rugged, and hopelessly outmatched in a turning fight. Grumman had built it like a flying safe with armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks that the Zero lacked. This meant American pilots could survive hits that would turn a Zero into a fireball. But survival was not victory, and every week more Wildcats went down, more pilots were lost, and the arithmetic of attrition favored Japan. Into this grinding calculus stepped a man whose job was not to fight. He was an operations officer, a staff position. His role was logistics, scheduling, and coordination. He had logged thousands of hours in cockpits, but his combat record was empty. In a squadron of men who measured worth in kills, he was invisible. Yet he watched, and what he watched was death following a pattern. If this history matters to you, tap, like, and subscribe. John Smith Thatch was born in 1905 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a town whose primary claim was cotton and its position along the slow brown waters of the Arkansas River. His father was a doctor. His childhood was unremarkable. What set him apart was a mechanical mind that saw systems where others saw chaos. He entered the Naval Academy in 1923, an era when aviation was still regarded by battleship admirals as a novelty. Thatch chose it anyway. Something about flight appealed to his temperament, the precision of it, the physics made visible, the way a machine responded to exact inputs with exact results. By the mid-1930s, he was flying fighters off carriers, teaching younger pilots, and developing a reputation as a thinker in a profession that often prized instinct over analysis. He commanded Fighting Squadron 3, the VF-3, flying Grumman biplanes before transitioning to the new Wildcats. He drilled his men relentlessly, not just in gunnery, but in coordination, in thinking as pairs rather than individuals. When war came, Thach was 36 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards. He had never fired his guns in anger. What he had was something harder to quantify, a pattern recognition ability that bordered on obsessive. Before Pearl Harbor, he had obtained intelligence reports on the Zero. The numbers troubled him. Climb rate, turn radius, range, all superior to the Wildcat. He began running calculations, sketching diagrams, testing scenarios in his mind. The standard American fighter doctrine was to dogfight, to get on an enemy's tail and stay there. Against the Zero, this was suicide. The Japanese fighter could simply outturn any pursuit, reversing the situation in seconds. Thatch needed a different geometry. He began experimenting with two-plane elements, what the Navy called sections. Most squadrons fought as divisions of 4, but Thach focused on the smaller unit, 2 planes flying in loose formation, each, watching the other's blind spots. When attacked, instead of turning to pursue, they would turn toward each other, crossing paths, forcing any pursuing enemy into the guns of the wingman. He called it the beam defense maneuver. Others would call it the Thatch weave. On paper, it looked like running away. The initial turn took the lead fighter away from the attacker, not toward. It required trust, precise timing, and the willingness to use your wingman as bait. Experienced pilots hated it. It felt wrong. It surrendered the initiative. It depended on someone else to make the kill. Thatch did not care how it felt. He cared about the math. The problem was not simply that the Zero was better. The problem was that American pilots were dying while following doctrine that had been developed against European opponents. In 1941, American fighter tactics still reflected lessons from the First World War. Individual combat, the dogfight, the turning duel, where the better pilot won. Squadron integrity was loose. Pilots were encouraged to find their own fights, to chase kills, to prove themselves in single combat. This worked well enough against aircraft of comparable performance. Against the Zero, it was a death sentence. The Japanese pilots exploited American aggressiveness. They would present themselves as bait, luring a Wildcat into a turning engagement, then use their superior maneuverability to reverse and fire. American pilots would realize too late that they could not follow the turn. By the time they tried to disengage, the Zero was behind them, and the mathematics of 600 rounds per minute made the outcome inevitable. Reports filtered back from the Philippines, from Wake Island, from the desperate carrier battles of the Coral Sea. The Zero dominated. American squadrons were being attrited faster than replacements could arrive. Worse, the survivors were learning the wrong lessons, becoming cautious, defensive, unwilling to engage. Morale collapsed alongside kill ratios. The Navy's response was more training, more gunnery practice, more exhortations to aggressiveness. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. The tactics were wrong. Thatch understood this with the clarity of an engineer examining a failed bridge. The structure itself was flawed. Patching it would not prevent collapse. It needed to be redesigned from the foundations. He took his diagrams to his commanding officer. The response was polite dismissal. The Navy had doctrine. The doctrine had been proven in exercises. What Thatch was proposing was unconventional, unproven, and uncomfortably close to an admission that American pilots needed a crutch to survive against an Asian enemy. The racial dimension was never spoken aloud, but it pervaded everything. Admitting the Zero's superiority meant admitting American intelligence had failed, that assumptions of Western technological dominance were unfounded. This was not a comfortable conclusion for admirals who had spent careers believing in American supremacy. Thatch pressed anyway. He requested time to test his tactics in exercises. He was granted grudging permission but little support. If his weave failed, it would be forgotten. If it succeeded, perhaps someone would notice. The first tests were conducted over San Diego in early 1942. Thatch and his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, flew against a squadron simulating zero tactics. O'Hare would later become famous, the Navy's first ace of the war, but at that moment he was simply a skilled pilot willing to try something strange. They flew the weave against 4 opponents, then 6. Each time the attackers found themselves unable to complete their passes. Every attempt to pursue one Wildcat brought the attacker across the guns of the other. The geometry worked, but exercises were not combat. Pilots in training flights did not shoot back with real ammunition. The psychological pressure was absent. Thatch knew his weave would only be validated in blood. Midway provided the test. On June 4, 1942, Thatch led a 6-plane division of Wildcats as escort for the torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carrier fleet. The torpedo planes were obsolete. Douglas Devastators, slow, vulnerable, and armed with torpedoes that frequently failed to detonate. They flew straight and level during their attack runs, perfect targets for defending Zeros. Thatch's job was to protect them. It was an impossible task. The Zeros came in swarms, perhaps 15 or 20 against his 6 Wildcats. The geometry of escort meant he could not flee. He had to stay with the bombers. He implemented the weave. What happened in the next minutes would become legend. Thach and his wingman crossed and recrossed, each pass presenting a fresh firing solution. Zeros attempting to pursue one Wildcat found themselves sliding into the gun sight of another. The confusion among the attackers was visible, their coordination breaking down as they tried to adapt to a defensive pattern they had never encountered. Thatch personally accounted for 3 confirmed kills. His section claimed several more. But the larger achievement was survival. Against overwhelming odds, the weaving fighters remained intact, long enough for the torpedo bombers to make their runs. Those torpedo bombers were slaughtered anyway. Only 6 of 41 Devastators survived the attack. But their sacrifice, combined with the dive bombers that arrived moments later, led to the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers. Midway turned the tide of the Pacific War, and buried in the after-action reports was evidence that a new tactic had worked. Guadalcanal became the proving ground. By autumn of '42, the Cactus Air Force was desperate. Henderson Field was bombed daily. Pilots slept in foxholes. Malaria was endemic. Aircraft were patched together from salvage. The Zeros came with every raid, and the kill ratios remained unfavorable. Thatch was not present on Guadalcanal himself. He had been pulled back to training duties, his experience deemed too valuable to risk. But his tactics traveled with the pilots he had trained, spreading through the squadrons by word of mouth, by demonstration, by the simple calculus of survival. Not everyone believed. Some squadron leaders dismissed the weave as overcomplicated, suitable perhaps for the parade ground exercises of stateside training, but useless in the chaos of actual combat. Others called it a defensive crutch, an admission that American pilots could not match their opponents in individual skill. The pilots who adopted it stopped dying at the same rate. The mathematics were stark. Squadrons that implemented 2-plane sections flying mutual support saw their loss rates drop by measurable percentages. Squadrons that continued the old tactics of individual dogfighting continued to lose pilots at unsustainable rates. One engagement in particular demonstrated the weave's potential. On October 25, 1942, Marine pilots from VMF 121 encountered a large formation of Zeros escorting bombers toward Henderson Field. The American fighters were outnumbered, flying weary aircraft with worn engines and patched airframes. By every conventional measure, they should have been overwhelmed. Instead, they executed the beam defense, sections weaving in coordinated patterns that turned defensive disadvantage into offensive opportunity. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to American fighters braking and running or attempting futile turning contests, found their attacks consistently countered. Each pass at a Wildcat presented the attacker's vulnerable profile to another American fighter. The claims from that engagement varied, as combat claims always did. Pilots in the heat of battle saw aircraft trailing smoke and assumed kills that may have been damaged planes reaching home. The fog of war made precise accounting impossible. But the operational reality was clear. The American squadron survived intact. Multiple Zeros did not return to their bases. The bombers scattered without completing their attack runs. 11 confirmed Japanese aircraft were attributed to that engagement in the official tally. The number may have been slightly lower in actual fact, as combat records from both sides remained incomplete. What mattered was the ratio. American losses, 0. Word spread through the island chain. Pilots who had mocked the fishhook maneuver began requesting instruction. Squadron leaders who had dismissed it as theoretical nonsense found themselves revising their tactical briefings. The Thatch weave became doctrine not through official mandate, but through natural selection. Pilots who used it survived. Pilots who did not were buried at sea or in the volcanic soil of jungle islands. The ripples extended far beyond Guadalcanal. By 1943, the Thatch weave had been incorporated into official Navy fighter doctrine. Training squadrons at Pensacola and Jacksonville drilled it relentlessly. New pilots arrived in the Pacific already fluent in the crossing maneuvers that had seemed so radical months before. The tactical impact was measurable in statistics. Kill ratios for American fighters improved steadily throughout the war. Part of this was technology, as the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair replaced the outmatched Wildcat. Part of it was training, as the Japanese Pilot Corps lost its experienced veterans to attrition. But part of it was tactics. The weave influenced more than just defensive combat. It changed how American pilots thought about cooperation. The old model of individual heroism, the lone ace racking up kills, gave way to a team-based approach where wingmen were valued as essential partners rather than subordinate observers. Section integrity became paramount. Pilots learned to think in pairs, to trust their wingmen absolutely, to sacrifice personal glory for collective survival. This shift had cascading effects. Bomber escort missions became more effective when fighters flew coordinated protection rather than breaking off to pursue individual targets. Air superiority campaigns achieved better results when multiple sections could concentrate firepower while maintaining mutual support. Even ground attack missions benefited from the disciplined approaches that weave training instilled. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed growing frustration among Zero pilots as American tactics evolved. The easy kills of early 1942 became harder to achieve. The Wildcats that had once been easy prey began fighting with unexpected effectiveness. By the time the Hellcat arrived in large numbers, the tactical advantage had shifted decisively. Numbers tell part of the story. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, American fighters suffered approximately a 1-to-1 exchange ratio against Zeros, despite flying heavier, better armored aircraft. By late 43, that ratio had shifted to better than 5-to-1 in American favor. By 44, it exceeded 10-to-1 in many engagements. Technology and attrition explained much of this shift. But tactics created the foundation on which technology could be effective. The Thatch weave did not win the air war by itself. It provided the framework within which American advantages in production, training, and engineering could be brought to bear. John Thatch survived the war. He rose to admiral, served through the Cold War, helped shape naval aviation doctrine for a generation. When he died in 1981, obituaries remembered him as a tactician, an innovator, a man who had changed how fighters fought. What the obituaries often missed was the quieter lesson of his story. Thatch was not a natural warrior. He had no particular love of combat, no thirst for kills, no warrior's instinct for violence. What he had was a systematic mind and the moral courage to challenge assumptions that were killing his friends. The Thatch weave succeeded not because it was aggressive, but because it was cooperative. It rejected the mythology of the lone hero in favor of the mathematics of mutual support. It acknowledged that American aircraft were inferior in some respects and designed a system to nullify those disadvantages. It required pilots to trust each other completely, to surrender individual glory for collective survival. In an era that celebrated individual aces and personal kill counts, this was radical. Many rejected it precisely because it felt unheroic. The initial laughter in that Guadalcanal briefing tent reflected a culture that valued personal combat over systematic thinking. The pilots who laughed died in roughly the proportions that mathematics predicted. The pilots who listened lived in roughly the proportions that mathematics allowed. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of innovation under fire. The ideas that save lives often come from unexpected sources, from operations officers rather than aces, from analysts rather than warriors. They often look wrong at first glance, counterintuitive, uncomfortable, contrary to established wisdom. The resistance they face is not simply institutional but emotional, rooted in identities and assumptions that feel more fundamental than mere tactics. Thatch succeeded because he was willing to be laughed at. He succeeded because he trusted mathematics more than tradition. He succeeded because he understood that the point of fighter tactics was not glory, but survival, not individual triumph, but collective victory. The fish hook that snapped 11 zeros was not really a weapon. It was a geometry of trust sketched on a chalkboard by a man who understood that war is not won by heroes alone, but by systems that let ordinary men survive long enough to win together. Somewhere over the Solomons, in skies that have long since returned to tropical peace, the ghosts of young pilots still fly their weaving patterns. They cross and recross, watching each other's tails, trusting in mathematics and in each other. They are not aces. They are not heroes in the mythological sense. They are simply men who learned that cooperation could defeat superiority, that system could overcome speed, that the right idea, adopted in time, could turn laughter into survival and ridicule into revolution. The Thatch weave remains in use today, adapted for jets and missiles, but fundamentally unchanged in its core principle: mutual support, coordinated defense, trust. Some victories echo forever, some tactics become permanent, and some men who never sought glory, who preferred chalkboards to gunfire, end up changing everything.